Welcome to Foundations, a series of introductory videos brought to you by the faculty of Memoria College. Each video in this series briefly introduces our students to a single text in the Western great books tradition. Each text is part of the core curriculum of the Memoria College Master's Program. If you would like to dig deeper into these texts, receive expert instruction from our faculty, and join other like-minded students in our live online classes, please visit us at memoriacollege.org. I'm Dan Scheffler. I'm here with Martin Cothran and Kyle Yankee, and today we are discussing one of my absolute favorite all-time texts, the Iliad of Homer. So, gentlemen, what makes the Iliad a great book?
Yeah. Well, I'll just throw out my initial thought at that question is it's so fully developed for something that's so old. I mean, and of course, this is you hear that it was basically a story passed down orally for many years, and somebody, we don't know who, wrote it down, and I don't know, nobody really knows the origins of the exact version that we possess today, but even when it was written down, it was still ancient, and for the story to be so fully developed as it is what kind of that's what struck me going through it again for this show is it's such a mature work, and yet it was done so long ago, in sort of the youth of our written culture.
People often think that works that are very old, back in the Bronze Age, have this primitive conception of human psychology, or a primitive, they're simplistic in their storytelling. They may be different in their perspective, in their psychology, different in their methods of storytelling, but simplistic or childish is the furthest thing from the truth.
I mean, it's definitely from another time. As a modern reader will read this and think this is so different, but the sophistication, the literary sophistication of the work itself is so fully developed that that's what's striking.
I think it's important to distinguish between simplistic and fundamental. That, I mean, it is a very straightforward text. Of course, I mean, famously it tells from the very beginning this is about rage. It's about anger and its price. So it's a very simple or fundamental or plain theme that it's building on. But that doesn't imply it's simplistic. It is, as you said, like very mature. Yeah.
Right. And I think often when we do these videos and when we throughout Memoria College, we really like to focus on the intrinsic qualities of the text itself. We like to read the text and see just what's actually in there and praise it for its goodness and its beauty, the quality of its writing, the ideas. But we also should mention the extrinsic impact of the text in history. Part of what makes it a great book is simply because it was so early. It stands at the very fountainhead of Greek and Roman culture, and therefore had an impact on everything that came after it. So the characters in the Iliad come up again and again and again in other works. It influenced Virgil's writing of the Aeneid. Aeneas is supposed to be a Trojan he is a Trojan who has escaped from the flames of Troy, and Virgil continues that story forward. Even later on in Britain, Geoffrey of Monmouth figures that the Britons are called the Britons because they descend from Brutus, who, like Aeneas, is supposed to be a Trojan who has escaped from the flames of Troy. Maybe just as much a stretch as Virgil's telling of a foundational myth for the Romans. But then, so that works its way into the Arthurian legends, and so all the Arthurian knights are supposed to be Trojans, right? And so you just can't read anything in the Western great books tradition without feeling the long shadow of Homer cast over it.
It's interesting. I mean, there's a drive, I think a fundamental human drive to know where we come from. and to come from some place. So, I mean, we're talking about, whether or not it's a stretch to say that, so-and-so is descended from such and such. But I at least understand that the human motivation I want to think that my people are from somewhere, right? I'm reminded of, sorry to jump to modern literature, but I'm reminded of a line in The Great Gatsby where Gatsby's people are described as shiftless, unsuccessful farm people. Meaning he comes from nowhere, and that's part of that modern feel of the novel. I think with the Iliad, we have it's the opposite feeling. Is there's something rooted about it, and it's also giving generations a sense of their own roots.
Right. And every culture needs some kind of founding myth, and the founding myth has a huge impact on our sense of identity, what we value, who we are. Where we come from determines where we're going. And even if it is ahistorical, if it's not factually true, I think modern writers tend to kind of focus on it being a stretch, that of course the Britons didn't really come from the Trojans. But the founding myth still gives an ideal. It's a way of thinking about ourselves and where we come from.
And a myth, the value of myth is, I guess, as I understand it, partly the meaning of the original word mythos, which is meaning. It gives meaning to things. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be an exact literal chronicle of actions of the past to have meaning. That's what a myth is. Myths are valuable in and of themselves, whatever their historicity. And I think that's why we go back as a civilization to the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid of Virgil, because it's laying down the fundamental meaning of things as we see them as Westerners. And so I was looking at Kyle's book there. It's really thick, and that's but it's worth going through. And I'm not sure. I don't know if you intended to talk about this, but I'm not sure also that we may have listeners out there who've never read much of any of this kind of work, and so they would look at that and think, well, that's a big thing to have to read, and it's hard to read for a modern reader if they're not used to that. So I always I tell people, and we do this in school to a certain extent, find a simpler retelling of it first, because really to be classically educated, you need to read it a bunch of times. Well, read an easier version first, and then maybe one that's a little more sophisticated, and then you can go to the original, at least in the English, and read it again to really digest it.
In our family, we have a graphic novel version of the Iliad that I picked up at one of these classical education conferences somewhere, and my boys loved that when they were little. I'm talking 5, 6, 7. They were eating that up, and so they knew the names of some of these fairly obscure warriors. Of course they knew Achilles, they knew Odysseus, they knew Nestor, they knew Ajax, but they would know some of these guys. I don't know, Neoptolemus or something that I would probably have forgotten. And so then when they got to reading the real thing in school, which of course I think they're not quite at the point of reading it in Greek yet. They're still reading in translation, but they'll get there. They'll read it in Greek here soon enough. When they got to reading the full text and translation, they had a much better grasp of the flow of the story, and I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that, and I don't think there's anything wrong with adults doing it.
No, well, I think that's right, because I just to prep for this program, I just I try to read a different version every time I read it, and I got Alfred J. Church's one that was really for young people from 100 years ago. Of course, it's because it's 100 years ago and it's for children. It's just quite fitting for adults today, But there were a lot of, particularly like turn of the century, there were a lot of retellings of these books that were published. And there's, I think, the Children's Homer, I think it's called. I think Patrick Collum has a version. There's a bunch of different versions of it that are more simple that you can start with. So I just wanted to make sure people knew that.
We always get this question: prose translation or poetry translation.
Mm.
I see the Fagel's poetry translation here. We have the younger students read the Butler's prose translation. What are the pros and cons?
Well, can I throw in
Yes,
something
yeah.
here? So my favorite version of the Odyssey is Andrew Lang's version. Okay, now the one we do here, I'm blanking on the name of the translator. Anyone remember it? We should. Oh, that's terrible. But there were, when they started to do these the English translations in the late 19th century, some pretty good authors really tried to tackle this. And Andrew Lang did this, and it's my favorite version of the Odyssey. I haven't read the Iliad in it yet by him. But he has this apologetic for it in his introduction. And he basically his argument, he doesn't explicitly say this, but it's implicit. It's the King James version. He's trying to write the King James version of the Odyssey, right? And I love the way his translation reads. The poetic version, I guess I have doubts about any poetic version, because poetry is so, I mean, the language itself is different from the original to the translated language, but also then you throw in the whole verse thing, where verse is, poetry is very differently stated in that language. So it's even further away. How do you're so at the mercy of the translator there. So I myself like the prose translation.
Yeah, I don't have much of a dog in this fight, honestly. I have this because it looked the best on the shelf, within the scope of things I could afford. So yeah, but I mean, one thing to consider. I do think I was thinking this as advice for reading when people are ready to tackle the original, like in translation, but move beyond a simpler retelling of it. I think often we approach reading looking for what happens next. We think of a story as, well, what happens next, right? And we talk about spoilers because we're brought up on movies that like, well, don't tell me what happens next because that'll ruin the story. And of course, when it comes to myth and the meaning of a myth, it's all wrapped up in, you already know the outcome. You already know what's going to happen, and nothing is spoiled, nothing is ruined. So my point is, I think there's a difference between reading to see what happens next and reading to let the weight of the event kind of rest on you. And I would ask, I don't know if poetic translations maybe do a better job of that, of the weight of the events that are taking place in the text, whereas a prose implies a sort of a sequence event-based narrative where we're looking for what happens next.
But if it's the King James version,
well,
if he succeeds in that project,
yes.
Well, I always try to remind my students that exactly as you said, the story here to the original audience would not have been original. They would have known the story of the Trojan War. They would have known who Achilles is, who Odysseus is, Helen being taken by Paris. All of that would have been background knowledge before even their first exposure to hearing the Iliad itself. These are old stories that are told in many different ways, and many of my students are in fact surprised to learn, because they've kind of heard rumors of the Iliad. They know it's about the story of the Trojan War. They're surprised to learn that the taking of Helen is not in the Iliad. That the whole bit about sacrificing Iphigenia to launch the ships, that's not in the Iliad. The whole Trojan horse, not in the Iliad. That really the entire text takes place over only a handful of days at the very end of the siege of Troy, but then the actual taking of the city is also not in the Iliad. And so I think it's useful for the students in coming to the text to maybe just go, if they don't know these stories ahead of time, go read the Wikipedia article or something on the Trojan War, or get the SparkNotes version, because that's what the ancient audience, they would have known these things. And I think it's pretty difficult to appreciate the story if you are trying to read it for information of what happens.
And
do they end up taking Troy?
and in a narrative vacuum, like you say, you
Right.
do need that background
Right,
to
right.
understand it.
Absolutely.
Sort of assumed, yeah. Now, in regard to the content of the story,
Mhm.
I just wanted to express something I've been thinking about with this, and that is that, and this was, and we talked about this in the office. I've been started E.R. Dodd's The Greeks and the Irrational, and when you read this story, you have the gods are doing things and making decisions and determining things, and then the characters are doing them completely doing those things, but completely independently and of their own free will. And I think that the Iliad is one of these very interesting stories where there is this interplay between predestination and free will that allows you to specifically. I've always said that seeming paradox is resolved in my mind by the whole idea of an author in the story. That if an author could write a story and the story became real, then there would have been predestination and free will. So there's this whole idea of a story relieves my mental cramp about that issue. Well, you see it all. This is a prime example of this, because the doings of the gods are actually in the story, and they are determining things, and yet there seems to be, the Greeks seem to have no problem with positing this sort of predestined end that the gods are determining from above, and yet the characters are actually doing these deeds and doing them of their own volition. So that's in this last going through it again. This is the thing that I was thinking about when I was reading it this time.
Well, we might have to have a fight about that. That would take us well beyond the bounds of this video, because I think one of the conspicuous things.
I will gird up my loins for that.
Oh,
fight.
right.
Yes.
We will dress for action. One of the conspicuous elements in the text, to my mind, is the sort of ontological status of the gods. That the gods, in some ways, are portrayed as these transcendent entities, sort of. They're kind of cosmic forces in one way. But in other moments, they're portrayed in a very human way, in a very finite way. And they seem to have limitations and be characters on the stage within the story, and not so much the author of the story at a higher transcendent level, in the way that your analogy
right, because the for one, there are multiple gods and they disagree, so you don't have that in the Christian conception of God, who's just one being and determining actions. I agree with that, but I still think there is this bifurcation between what's going on in the world, what's going on in heaven, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, okay, so Dan, to your point, the death of Sarpedon and the exchange where Zeus he wants to do something about it, and then he is convinced by Hera that no, he should not do something about it. And so it this thing happens against the will of Zeus.
Well, something happens when he's asleep.
Yeah, right. Right.
Yeah.
Which I think that's to your point, but it's interesting. So, an author writing a story is still beholden to the way things are. They can't. They're not just inventing out of their minds. I think. So calling on the muses, Homer calling on the muses and saying, tell how it happened, right? He's not inventing out of his own head, like, what if this happened? What if that happened? It happened a certain way, and he's retelling it. So he is still. It's interesting that just what you're saying. There's this balance of, he is bringing something into being, but it is according to some sort of preset mold. Right? Yeah.
Interesting questions for maybe our students to keep in mind as they go read the text, which is a nice segue. We always like to end these videos by each of us giving the students who are going to go read the text now for themselves, give them a reading assignment. So, Martin, if you were to assign something for the students, to either a theme to look for or a question to ask as they go off and read the
the only recommendation is kind of what I said before, is don't feel reticent to read an easier version of this, because you've said before, even in the show. I recommend Alfred Church's translation. I think that's a great way to start if you haven't already, done that.
And perhaps you already gave your assignment to just look for the free will.
Take note
question.
of this interaction between the gods and the characters in the story, and just try to think about that relationship and how that works.
Right. Are the gods determining
Yes.
the events?
Yes.
Or are the heroes and their heroism determining the events? Or both?
Are they both? Yes.
Yeah. My assignment would be to look specifically for the wonderful and glorious nature metaphors that saturate the text. I think this jumps to the forefront whenever I read the Iliad. Everybody knows, of course, the famous ones like the wine-dark sea or the rosy-fingered dawn. But if you start to look, virtually everything in the text is described in terms of comparing one thing that's happening to some other thing, and that other thing is more often than not some element in nature. So warriors fall like a tree that has been chopped down, or the blood gushes from their wounds like a spring, right? Yeah. I think
that's for the boys who are reading.
It adds a lot of fun to reading the text, to go and kind of mark these and hunt down the choice ones. And my assignment would be to specifically pick 5 of them that are the most chef's kiss.
Yeah, I suppose we'd be remiss if we didn't mention as a warning, this is violent. The Iliad involves there's blood gushing frequently. So I know that's advice number 1. But no, so 2 things. One, and this is about that relationship between gods and men, which I find fascinating in the Iliad as well. Look up the Metope sculpture, which is a little relief sculpture on the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, of depicting Heracles holding up the sky, and it gives I find a really helpful visual example of that relationship between gods and men. You've got Heracles the man, bent under the weight of the sky, and you've got Athena the goddess helping him. She is also supporting the weight, but her posture, it just denotes she's not supporting the weight in the same way that wretched and toiling man does. And I see the same kind of distinction, that same kind of interplay between the gods and men are supporting the same weight, but it weighs on them differently throughout the Iliad, which I think might be an interesting image to have in the back of your mind. But then one other thing, just quickly, I spent years of my life and hours reading the Iliad and other things, looking for some secret symbolism that would kind of unlock the whole thing. Like once I figured out the symbolism, then I'd understand what Homer's after. And I think the whole time just missing the very much more fundamental, simple point of human sympathy. So my advice would just be to sympathize with the characters. Think about Achilles' rage at the beginning, and can you sympathize with him? It's very easy to mock him as like, oh, he's just being a petulant child. He's being a baby. But no, aren't we all like that? And can you sympathize with what he's feeling, and do you have similar feelings? And let that sympathy take you through the text.
Very good. Nice. Very good. Well, thank you all for joining us in this very brief introduction to the Iliad. We hope that you will go off, read it, savor it, and join us in one of our Memoria College classes discussing this text. I would love to see you there. Visit us at memoriacollege.org.